Now let's have Obamacare as applied to food. You will now be allowed to go to the grocery store and order whatever you want. Fill up your cart, you don't have to pay. Somebody else will pay. What's going to happen? The first thing that will happen is you'll take all kinds of stuff that you don't need. You'll fill your cart, you'll buy 12 cartons of milk and 45 cartons of bologna. And then you go up to the counter, and the grocery store will realize that they can charge whatever they want because you're not paying. So they will escalate their prices. The basic idea is that what's going on, you and the grocery store are conspiring to rip off the taxpayer. A third man is being cheated. And so what's going on with free education, free healthcare, is the taxpayer is being ripped off to give so-called free stuff. 100 of us each have $10. Total equality. We all have 10 bucks. Now, one of us, this guy right here, decides to write a book. Let's call it The Adventures of Harry Potter. And he writes the book, and he offers it for sale for $2. And not all of us go for it, but many of us do. Half of us say, all right, we like this idea. Here's $2. Let's have a copy of your book. So that's 50 guys who've come up with $2. So he now has $110. Why? 50 times 2, that's 100, plus his original 10. He has $110. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of us have gone down from $10 to $8. So you now have the $8 people, the $10 people, and then the 1%er right here who actually has the $110. A lot of inequality has now been generated. But where is the injustice? In other words, who's been cheated? Who's been deprived of their fair share? No one, as far as I can see, because we all voluntarily parted with our $2. Nobody forced us. Nobody put a gun to our head. So where is the injustice? Now, I want to suggest that the CEOs who make this kind of, let's call it filthy money, i.e. huge amounts of it, are actually a subset and a very special type of entrepreneur. They're actually supply-side entrepreneurs. And here's what I mean. When you take Economics 101, they teach you about supply and demand. And what business really does is it supplies demand. So people want food. And so you've got Safeway and Kroger's, and they supply food. And you want cars. And so you've got Ford, and you've got Chrysler, they supply cars. But that's not actually where the big profits are. The big profits go to guys like Steve Jobs. Why? Because they don't actually supply anyone's demand. Nobody wrote letters to Steve Jobs and go, hey Steve, listen, I got this idea for a phone. You know what? It needs to have apps. It needs to be connected to the internet. It needs to do this, it needs to do that. No demand. Steve Jobs thought of it before there was a demand for it. He anticipated the demand. Then he didn't just think of it, because lots of us think of great ideas and do nothing about them. He then had to organize making it. He had to take all the risk. By the way, none of the Apple employees take any risk. Because if Apple has a bad quarter, Jobs can go to them and go, hey, bad quarter, guys, give me half your paychecks back. Employees take no risk. They want a flat fee for what they do, and it's a one-time exchange. The entrepreneur doesn't do that. He gets paid at the end. So the point I'm trying to make is that Steve Jobs thought of the iPhone, he made it, he organized it, and he took all the risk, and he put it on the market before you knew you couldn't live without it. That's the kind of guy who makes a huge pile of dough. There are two views of America, and very briefly, I will call them the ladder and the rope. Ladders of opportunity, that's the Republican Party. You climb the ladder. The government has a job to hold the ladder. The rope is the Democratic approach, which is basically, we Democrats at the top of a tall building, we're going to let down a rope. You hang on. We'll pull you up. So the rope is more appealing than the ladder because the ladder involves work. You have to climb. The rope, you only have to hold on. But it dawned on me early in my career that while the rope is easier, the truth of it is you always be beholden to the guy holding the rope. If he lets you go, down you go. And then I noticed that lots of people who are being pulled up never get pulled all the way up.
They never become self-sufficient. They're always hanging. And then it crossed my mind that maybe the people who are holding the rope prefer them to remain hanging because they remain in a position of beholdenness politically. And if they ever scrambled onto the shore, they might dust off and walk off. Who needs the Democratic Party? So it may be, at the end of the day, and this is what I tell my students as well, you have to choose. Do you want the ladder or do you want the rope? And at the end of the day, we have to make our own choice.
The first is that whites in the South, who used to be Democrats, do now predominantly vote Republican.
Yep.
Right? Fact number two is that blacks, who used to vote Republican, now vote overwhelmingly Democratic.
Yep.
And operating on the assumption, which I think is reasonable, that people understand where their own interests lie, it would certainly be right that blacks currently see their identification and their interest in the Democratic Party. Now, here are two interesting questions to ask. Number one, when did blacks switch from being Republicans to being Democrats? The Democratic Party was the party of the Dixiecrats all the way through the 60s. And if what you say is true, that the blacks made a switch to their racial friends, it would appear that the black switch would have to come in the 70s and 80s, when blacks see these racists are now moving over there, so it makes sense for us to move over here. But in reality, blacks moved overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party in the 1930s. The black vote went from about 15% Democratic to about 70% Democratic within 4 years.
The places they could vote.
That's right, but
Which was the North.
also in the
Jackie Robinson was a Republican for darn good reason.
That's absolutely right. But here's what I'm getting at.
Wouldn't be today.
We can debate Jackie Robinson because it's always difficult to know what dead people would say. If Martin Luther King were alive today, Martin Luther King isn't alive today. Okay, but here's the point I'm getting at. The reason that blacks switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party had everything to do with the benefits of the New Deal and nothing to do with racism. In fact, yes, and in the South, too, blacks switched to the Democratic Party. It's not that blacks couldn't vote in the South. It's that there were all kinds of barriers to black voting. Under FDR, there was blacks couldn't vote in the South at all. No blacks voted in the South.
Very, very few.
How many? How many?
I don't know.
Okay. I thought so. Look, there were all kinds of poll taxes and barriers imposed by the Democrats on the black vote until the Democrats realized that they could get the black vote by offering jobs, welfare, retirement programs. Are you telling me that FDR in the South was telling blacks who were voting for the Democrats, you can't vote? Not true. Not true. Blacks in the North and the South switched to the Democratic Party because of New Deal benefits. Many of them were very sad about doing it because they were leaving the party of emancipation and Lincoln and flinging themselves into the party of the Ku Klux Klan and the Dixiecrats who were in the South and were in the Democratic Party. Exactly. So what I'm saying is it was a Faustian bargain in which you get economic benefits and at the same time you're in bed with the racists and you're on your own team. And I'm saying that's American history. Now, whites began to switch to the Republican Party, but much later. Whites began to switch to the Republican Party in droves in the 70s and 80s. Now, here's the point. If you look at racial opinion in the South, and there's a voluminous body of data on this, as racism in the South dramatically declines, the Southern identification with the Republican Party begins to increase. There's an opposite track. Racism is declining in the South, and whites begin to move to the Republican Party. In fact, two scholars who've written a book about this trace that the least racist Southerners all became Republicans. That the poor white racist Democrat never became a Republican. He was a dug-in Democrat to the end of his days. So the Democratic Party remained the party of racism. And as the South became less agrarian, more prosperous, industry came to the South, the post-industrial society, the Republican appeal of equal opportunity, free markets, prosperity, appealed to Southerners. And that's why so what I'm getting at is that the progressives have sold the South on a guilt trip. Even this whole thing about, the Civil War was really about slavery and the South did slavery. Wait a minute. Again, The Northern Democrats protected slavery. The Civil War, the fight over slavery, was between the Democratic Party, North and South, that protected it, and the Republican Party, which only was in the North, that opposed it. That's what that fight was about. It wasn't just the North-South thing is now a disguise to hide the responsibility of a major political party that was the party of slavery for 100 years.